In 1957, Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman released one of the most powerful images ever recorded in the history of cinema. A medieval knight, freshly returned from the Crusades, plays chess with death on a desolate beach, while dark clouds herald the end of times. The game is not just for his physical life, but for answers. The knight wants to know if God exists, if there is meaning in pain, if death is truly the end. He believes that if he can delay checkmate, he might decipher the great enigmas of existence. It is a symbol that resonates deeply with the modern human condition. Since always, man has tried to negotiate with death, with fate, with reality itself. We try to solve life as if it were a mathematical equation, a logical problem that, once solved, would finally bring us peace. We live immersed in self-help books, personal development courses, philosophical systems, therapies, religions, and productivity techniques, all promising us the formula to eliminate uncertainty. But there is something profoundly tragic in this search. This is what the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spoke about in the 19th century. For him, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. The more one tries to dissect it, explain it, or control it through reason, the more it slips through one's fingers, like fine sand. Kierkegaard saw the human being as a being torn between two irreconcilable dimensions, finitude and infinitude. We are finite creatures, trapped in time, in flesh, in space, yet tormented by the desire to encompass the infinite, whether in terms of knowledge, purpose, or transcendence. This fundamental anguish drives us to create systems. Some seek in aesthetic hedonism the missing meaning, diving into momentary pleasures. Others embrace ethical life, trying to find stability in duty, in morality, in social conventions. And there are those who take refuge in religion, hoping for absolute answers that will silence, once and for all, the abyss of the unknown. Kierkegaard analyzed all of this in depth, showing how even our noblest constructions, philosophical, religious, scientific, can become sophisticated forms of existential procrastination. We are so busy trying to understand life that we forget to live it. And, like Bergman's knight, we remain seated at the table, moving pieces on the board, convinced that if we find the perfect strategy, we will defeat death. But Kierkegaard warns, there is no victory in this game. The true leap is not to win the game, but to abandon the board. It is to choose to live, despite the not knowing, to embrace the paradox, the mystery, the risk. Today's video dives exactly into this point. It will not bring magical formulas to solve life, but an invitation to stop being merely a spectator, analyst, planner, and to start truly living. Because, as Kierkegaard said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. And for those who feel that they are right now trapped in an endless game of chess against death, perhaps it is time to let go of the pieces and look at the sea. Since the dawn of philosophy, the human intellect has been celebrated as the supreme tool to conquer the world, decipher the mysteries of nature, and secure for man a privileged place in the cosmos. From ancient Greece to the Enlightenment, spanning centuries of science, logic, and rational critique, we have been taught to believe that thinking deeply, analyzing meticulously, and seeking logical coherence would be the way to attain truth, and consequently, freedom and happiness. But Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the first half of the 19th century, raises a disconcerting warning against this almost religious faith in the power of the intellect. For him, there is something profoundly tragic in the way we use reason to try to capture life in concepts, systems, and categories. He observed that the intellect, this tool that should serve to liberate us, often transforms into an invisible prison. The intellect, for Kierkegaard, functions like a sharp blade. It can open paths for us to understand the world, but it can also cut us deeply. The more we use reason to scrutinize every detail of existence, the further we drift away from the raw and vital pulse of immediate experience. We become trapped in a labyrinth of endless reflections, debating hypotheses, constructing and deconstructing philosophical systems, while real life, with its flavors, pains, encounters, and farewells, passes by outside, ignored. He writes in one of his most famous passages that the greatest danger of all, losing oneself, can happen very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing. The tragedy of the intellect is this: the individual can lose themselves in the exercise of understanding everything, without realizing that, in this effort, they abandon themselves. The knight in the seventh seal, whom we saw in the introduction, is the living portrait of this tragedy. He seeks absolute answers. He wants to know if God exists, if suffering has a purpose, if death is indeed the end. But while negotiating with death, he is absent from the present, unable to look into the eyes of the people he loves or to feel the sea breeze. His life becomes a chessboard of strategies. Kierkegaard identifies that, behind this intellectual effort, there is fear. Fear of chaos, fear of emptiness, fear of discovering that there are no definitive answers. The human being, he says, is a finite being tormented by the desire for the infinite. And this tension creates existential anguish. To anesthetize this anguish, we build intellectual castles, religions, theories, philosophies, dogmas. But these castles, although grand, are fragile in the face of the insurmountable mystery of life. And there is a subtle danger, the illusion of control. When we believe we have understood life, we feel a false sense of security. But in reality, we are merely watching life from the outside, as spectators. We live in the realm of abstractions, disconnected from the concreteness of experience. Reason, for Kierkegaard, should be the servant of life, not its master. When it takes the throne, it transforms existence into an unsolvable problem. The Danish philosopher was not against thought, far from it. He himself was a brilliant and profound thinker. But he warned that the intellect, when erected as an absolute sovereign, robs the spontaneity, passion, and risk necessary to live authentically. He denounces what he calls the spectator of one's own life, one who lives analyzing everything, planning every step, but never truly steps onto the stage. And here is the great turning point that Kierkegaard proposes. Perhaps life cannot be understood in all its breadth. Perhaps it can only be lived. And living implies uncertainty, contradiction, paradox. It implies feeling fear and nonetheless moving forward. But if we cannot resolve life through reason, what is left for us? How then do we deal with this anguish that devours us from within? Kierkegaard's answer begins to emerge when he invites us to look at the ways we try to solve life, staged in the three stages he so brilliantly described: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. That is where we will go in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. If there is something that makes Søren Kierkegaard an absolutely singular thinker, it is the way he mapped human existence into three stages or spheres, through which human beings desperately try to solve the enigma of life. These stages are not merely abstract philosophical categories, but deeply concrete ways of living, of positioning oneself in the face of anguish, freedom, and existential emptiness. Each of them represents, in its own way, an attempt to escape the abyss of uncertainty, a strategy to resolve life and silence the anguish that consumes us from within. The first is the aesthetic stage. In it, the individual lives driven by pleasure, novelty, and sensations. It is the realm of impulses, the incessant search for stimuli, for exciting experiences that anesthetize boredom. For the aesthete, the greatest enemy is routine. The meaning of life is always in the next event, the next romantic conquest, the next pleasure. But there is a fatal problem. Everything quickly becomes monotonous. Pleasure, no matter how intense, is ephemeral. The aesthete, when not laughing or seducing, often finds himself torn apart by boredom and melancholy. Kierkegaard illustrates this stage with characters like Don Juan, eternally in search of the next woman, but always empty inside. The aesthete is a fugitive from anguish, but ironically, he is also its prisoner. For living only for pleasure ends up revealing existential emptiness with even more brutality. Frustrated with the superficiality of aesthetic life, many individuals move on to the ethical stage. Here, stability is sought through commitment, duty, and moral rules. The individual begins to see themselves as part of a collective and takes on responsibilities, whether in marriage, work, or society. The meaning of life becomes found in order, coherence, and the construction of a solid identity. The ethical man wants to be predictable, reliable, someone who has values. He abandons the constant search for pleasures and begins to want to do the right thing. However, Kierkegaard shows that even this stage is often a subtle way of trying to control the uncertainty of existence. Morality, social conventions, and the sense of duty can become another system that, although nobler than the aesthetic, is still an attempt to resolve life, to avoid direct confrontation with the absurd and with one's own radical freedom. Ethical life offers security, but not necessarily meaning. And then there is the religious stage, the most mysterious and paradoxical. Here, Kierkegaard speaks of an existence that transcends both the aesthetic pursuit of pleasure and the ethical rigidity of morality. It is the domain of paradox, absurdity, and the leap of faith. Not necessarily a leap into an institutionalized religion, but an existential leap, where the individual accepts that there are dimensions of life that cannot be understood, only lived. Kierkegaard uses the supreme example of Abraham, willing to sacrifice Isaac in obedience to God, despite violating all ethical norms. He calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical. In the religious stage, the individual recognizes that reason cannot encompass everything, that living requires embracing contradictions, that true faith is not certainty, but passion in the face of the unknown. But Kierkegaard makes it clear, the religious stage is not an escape from anguish, but a place where it is faced with courage. It is in the leap of faith that the individual finally stops trying to resolve life as a logical enigma and decides to live it with all its uncertainty, intensity, and risk. Here, there are no guarantees. There are no absolute certainties. There is only the commitment to live passionately, even amidst the paradox. And it is precisely in this religious stage that Kierkegaard introduces one of the most disturbing and fascinating concepts in all of philosophy, the teleological suspension of the ethical. It is about that moment when the individual sometimes needs to abandon even their most sacred ethical convictions in the name of something greater and often incomprehensible that we will discuss in the next part. Because if living requires courage, it sometimes also requires sacrificing certainties that we think we cannot live without. If there is a term that runs through all of Kierkegaard's work like a red thread, that term is anxiety, or in Danish, angst. For him, anxiety is not just an unpleasant feeling that we should eliminate. It is, paradoxically, the deepest sign of human freedom. It is also the engine that pushes us, through winding paths, to try to resolve life in systems, beliefs, or routines. Kierkegaard observes that human beings live torn between two poles. We are finite beings, limited by the body, by time, by historical circumstances. But at the same time, we are capable of conceiving the infinite, the absolute, the eternal, the transcendent. We are temporal creatures who dream of what is eternal. And this chasm between finitude and infinitude generates a very specific type of malaise: existential anxiety. He defines anxiety as the vertigo of freedom. When the individual realizes that they can choose, that they are free in front of an almost infinite field of possibilities, a dizzying emptiness arises. Anxiety is not simply fear. Fear has an object: fear of losing a job, fear of dying, fear of the dark. But anxiety is much more diffuse, without a clear object. It is a deep discomfort in the face of the openness of the possible. For Kierkegaard, the child is an excellent example of this phenomenon. At first, the child is not fully aware of freedom, but at a certain moment, they awaken to the fact that they can choose. And at that instant, anxiety arises. The world ceases to be just an external given and becomes a field of decisions. The human being finds themselves facing the immense weight of being responsible not only for what they do, but for what they become. And here the tragedy begins. To escape this vertigo, we desperately seek systems that provide us with security. It is at this point that philosophy, religion, morality, and even science come into play. All these human constructions can function to a greater or lesser degree as defenses against anxiety. They offer explanations, rules, promises of meaning. They are walls we build to avoid facing the void. But Kierkegaard is relentless. He says that often these systems are merely existential procrastination. While we are busy trying to understand or organize life, we stop living it. We are mentally absent from the present, anesthetized in the illusion of control. The anxiety, which could be the engine for a more intense and true life, ends up buried under routines, dogmas, and artificial certainties. In modernity, this anxiety manifests in various forms: chronic anxiety, a sense of emptiness, crises of meaning, paralyzing fear of making mistakes. Technology, social media, the cult of performance, all of this amplifies the feeling that we are never where we should be. We live tormented by the fear of wasting life, but also unable to fully throw ourselves into it. Kierkegaard foresaw this when he said that anxiety is the state of one who is on the verge of freedom. However, for the Danish philosopher, anxiety is not just a burden. It is also an invitation to recognize our radical freedom, to accept that there are no guarantees, but that precisely for that reason, we can live authentically. Anxiety calls us to decide, even without certainties, to choose to be protagonists and not just spectators. It is this anxiety that often leads us to desire certainties so absolute that we would be willing to sacrifice our most sacred principles in the name of something we believe to be greater. This is where one of the most intriguing and controversial concepts in Kierkegaard's philosophy comes in: the teleological suspension of the ethical. In the next part, we will delve into this fascinating concept. We will discover what leads a man to be willing to violate everything he considers right and good, not out of whim, but out of fidelity to something absolute. And we will understand why Kierkegaard uses the story of Abraham ready to sacrifice Isaac as the greatest example of this existential dilemma. For those hearing it for the first time, the expression teleological suspension of the ethical may sound like an academic enigma, distant from real life. But in Kierkegaard's philosophy, it is a key that unlocks one of the darkest, and at the same time, most liberating, doors of human experience. The word teleological comes from the Greek telos, which means end, purpose, or goal. When Kierkegaard speaks of the teleological suspension of the ethical, he is saying that there may be situations in which the individual, driven by an absolute purpose, finds himself compelled to suspend, that is, to put in parentheses, universal ethical norms. It is not about disregarding ethics or living in an amoral way. Rather, it is about recognizing that there are experiences so profound, so radical, that they completely escape common ethical criteria. The most famous and the most disturbing example is that of Abraham, narrated in the Old Testament. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, the son of promise, the heir through whom Abraham would be the father of a great nation. Humanly, morally, ethically, such an order is absurd, monstrous. No morality could justify killing an innocent child. But Kierkegaard, in the book Fear and Trembling, insists that Abraham is neither a murderer nor a fanatic. He is the knight of faith. He suspends the ethical, not because he despises morality, but because he is obeying an absolute call, something that cannot be translated into ethical terms or understood by men. He is in direct and absolute relation with the absolute, that is, with God. This places Abraham in a terrible and lonely position. He cannot explain his action. If he were to tell anyone, "I am going to kill my son because God commanded," he would be seen as mad or criminal. And indeed, if God did not exist, Abraham would be just that, a monster. Kierkegaard writes, "If there is no God, then Abraham is a murderer. But if there is God, Abraham is the greatest example of faith." It is here that the most unsettling dimension of Kierkegaard's thought comes in. Faith is not a rational certainty. It lives in paradox, in contradiction. It demands from the individual extreme courage, the courage to act without guarantees, to face the abyss, to risk everything for something that no one else can see or understand. True faith, for Kierkegaard, is not cheap. It is always accompanied by fear and trembling. But Kierkegaard is not only talking about religion or biblical figures. The teleological suspension of the ethical is also a metaphor for human situations in which we are led to decisions for which there are no pre-established rules. These are limit moments in which we need to choose between following ethical duty or obeying something that we feel deep down to be our most intimate truth. It may be abandoning a marriage because one feels they are betraying their own essence. It may be denouncing an oppressive regime, even knowing that one will be betraying the current law. It may be choosing an artistic path against all family and social expectations. In each case, there is a sacrifice, and there is loneliness, because no one can validate from the outside whether that leap is legitimate or just madness. This is the crucial difference between the knight of faith and the criminal. The former does not seek personal advantage, does not act on a whim. He acts out of fidelity to something absolute, even without being able to prove or justify his actions. That is why Kierkegaard says that the knight of faith lives in an unsolvable paradox. He loves deeply what he is willing to sacrifice. Abraham loves Isaac more than anything, and yet he raises the knife to obey God. In that gesture, there is pain, there is anguish, but there is also freedom. A freedom that cannot be explained, only lived. But after all, if life cannot be resolved by reason, if even ethics can be suspended in the name of something greater, how then to live fully without going mad in the face of so many uncertainties? Is there any way to live fully without guarantees? It is precisely this question that leads us to the next part, where we will dive into Kierkegaard's most famous and most inspiring a concept, the leap of faith. Because perhaps the only way to live is to leap, even in the dark. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. We have finally arrived at the most emblematic and perhaps most misunderstood concept in Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy, the leap of faith. Few terms have been used and distorted as much over the years. For many, jumping for faith has become synonymous with believing blindly in something, without thinking, without questioning, merely out of tradition or fear. But for Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is not that. It is not an invitation to pure irrationality, nor an escape from individual responsibility. On the contrary, it is the most radical expression of courage and freedom that a human being can achieve. The leap of faith arises from what we explored in the previous part: the recognition that there are insurmountable limits to reason. There comes a point where the intellect hits the wall of mystery. All explanations, systems, doctrines, and philosophies fail to account for the paradox that is life. And it is precisely there, at the limit of understanding, that the decisive choice arises. Either the individual takes refuge in the illusory security of manufactured certainties, or accepts to plunge into the unknown, trusting that there is meaning even when they cannot see it. For Kierkegaard, faith is not the denial of reason, but its complement where it can no longer advance. The leap is not made into absolute emptiness, but into a darkness where the individual still feels, viscerally, that something transcends their capacity for understanding. It is like someone trapped in a fire who needs to jump out of a window. There are no guarantees of survival, but staying put means certain death. The leap, therefore, is the desperate yet passionate bet that there is ground on the other side, even without proof. He writes in Fear and Trembling, "Faith begins precisely where thought ends." This is the drama of the leap. It only exists because there is uncertainty. If there were certainty, it would not be faith. It would be knowledge. True faith can only be born when everything around seems absurd, when logic screams that it makes no sense to continue. But the leap of faith is not only religious in the institutional or doctrinal sense. Kierkegaard speaks of faith as an existential stance. It is the decision to live fully, even knowing that life is paradoxical, fragile, and uncertain. It is to love deeply, knowing that love can bring pain. It is to commit to a cause, knowing that one may never see the result. It is to have children, write books, create art, start a business, move to a new city, even without knowing if everything will work out. Faith, in this sense, is the courage to exist, to participate in life rather than merely observe it. The leap of faith is the radical denial of the role of spectator. Kierkegaard said that many live as if they were watching a play, analyzing, judging, criticizing, but never stepping onto the stage. Faith is to enter the scene, even trembling with fear. It is to take risks. It is to be willing to lose everything, because living fully requires risk. And perhaps this is the most beautiful point of Kierkegaard's thought. Faith does not eliminate anguish. It walks alongside it. The knight of faith is not someone without fear or doubts. It is someone who feels all of this intensely, yet still chooses to live. It is someone who, in the face of uncertainty, says, "Here I am." In practice, the leap of faith is the refusal to reduce life to a calculation. It is the decision to stop playing chess with death and instead dance with life. It is the willingness to live the paradox, to embrace the mystery, to throw oneself into the experience with all their strength, even knowing that there are no guarantees. But if all of this is true, an inevitable question arises: is it really worth living this way? What do we gain when we stop trying to solve life and finally start living it? It is precisely this answer, powerful, provocative, and liberating, that we will explore in the conclusion of the video. Because Kierkegaard has something profound to tell us about where true wisdom lies, and about what it truly means to be alive. After this entire journey through the labyrinths of Kierkegaard's thought, one thing becomes painfully clear. Life is not a puzzle that, once solved, offers us definitive peace. There is no magic formula, no philosophical or religious system capable of shielding us from chaos, loss, emptiness, or death. Life, Kierkegaard insists, is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be lived. This conclusion, for many, sounds almost like a condemnation. After all, wouldn't it be much more comfortable to have answers? Wouldn't it be safer to have a manual that tells us who we should be, what we should do, and how to ensure happiness? But Kierkegaard offers something far more valuable than certainties. He offers freedom. Freedom, however, is a double-edged sword, because living freely means taking responsibility for our choices. It means embracing uncertainty, knowing that ultimately no one can live life for us. It is being aware that there are no guarantees, yet still moving forward. It is enduring the vertigo of anguish and nonetheless deciding to exist with passion. The knight in the seventh seal plays chess with death, believing that if he can buy time, he will obtain answers that will set him free. But, in Kierkegaard's view, the only real freedom lies in letting go of the board, in stopping the negotiation with death, with fate, with the ultimate meaning of things, and instead diving into pure experience, because it is in concrete living, in joy and pain, in laughter and tears, that life reveals itself. The wisdom that Kierkegaard teaches us is not to know more, but to live more. It is not to have all the answers, but to endure the questions. It is not to eliminate anguish, but to walk with it, transforming it into fuel for a more intense existence. And perhaps the greatest truth he offers us is this: each of us is alone before the leap. No one can decide for us. No one can live our life. But we are also not completely directionless. There is something mysterious that calls us beyond our fears, a voice that tells us it is worth living, even without certainties. In the end, Kierkegaard does not want to imprison us in yet another system. He wants to free us to be true, whole individuals, capable of saying yes to life in all its uncertainty. He challenges us to stop being spectators and to become passionate participants in the spectacle that is existence. And now I ask you, what is your chessboard? What is keeping you trapped today, trying to solve life instead of living it? Share with me here in the comments. I want to know where you are in this journey and what is preventing you from taking the leap. And if this video made you think, provoked you, or left you with more questions than answers, subscribe to the channel. Here, we do not offer ready-made formulas. We offer courage to face the mystery. And don't forget to keep watching the next video, because it is also important. After all, the journey to truly live never ends.